My name is David Carlson. I'm with the University of Notre Dame Press. Thank you for joining us for our latest installment of our Books for Better Understanding series. Today we're joined by Ashley Marie Purpura and Susan Ashbrook Harvey to discuss Ashley's new book, Women in the Orthodox Tradition, Feminism, Theology, and Equality, which is now available from the University of Notre Dame Press. So our guest, Ashley, is Associate Professor in Religious Studies at Purdue University. She researches and teaches about religion and gender from a variety of perspectives and specializes in the study of Orthodox Christianity and its Byzantine heritage. Her scholarship explores how sources, practices, figures, and values from within this tradition are engaged to address complex contemporary issues. She is the author of God, Hierarchy, and Power, Orthodox Theologies of Authority from Byzantium, which was published by Fordham University Press in 2018. She co-edited Orthodox Tradition and Human Sexuality in 2022, and she is the co-editor of Rethinking Gender in Orthodox Christianity, which came out in 2023, which she co-edited with Susan Ashbrook Harvey. Susan Ashbrook Harvey is the Willard Prescott and Annie McClelland Smith Professor of History and Religion at Brown University. There, she specializes in late antique and Byzantine Christianity with a particular emphasis on Syriac studies. Her research touches on areas including asceticism, hagiography, women and gender, hymnography, homiletics, and piety in late antique Christianity. Her numerous publications include her latest book, Ministries of Song, Women's Voices in Ancient Syriac Christianity, which is coming out later this year with the University of California Press, and the book Scenting Salvation, Ancient Christianity and the Olfactory Imagination, which was published in 2006. All right, thank you both so much for joining me today, and I am now going to turn the conversation over to Susan.
Thank you, David, and thank you for this opportunity for me to talk with Ashley about this very important book, wonderful book, and also just an opportunity for us to think together about topics and concerns we share a great commitment to. And let's start with the book's title. You have the book there, I think, right at your hands. Yeah. Women in Orthodox Tradition in large letters, and then next to it, right there, Feminism, Theology, and Equality. So I think for some people, that title is going to be a bit arresting. For some of us, we'll be delighted to see there's finally a book with a title like that. But why don't you say something about why it's okay to have orthodoxy and feminism in the same title, and what's at stake with that, and who it is that you're trying to speak to?
Well, certainly, thank you, Susan, and thank you, David, again, also for this opportunity. Certainly, the title is also shaped by the press, so I don't want to throw the University of Notre Dame press under the bus, but when we submit a book, sometimes it has a different title. And so the initial title I had did not have the word feminism in it. And so when marketing kind of came back to me and said, this is one of the options we'd like you to consider, at first, even I, after having written the book, was a little like, if we have feminism, we have the F word in the title, will people read it? And I came to really embrace it. And I think kind of revising and going back and working through the book in those final moments, I saw that it was important to reclaim that term within an Orthodox context. And certainly for those that don't see any kind of issues within the Orthodox tradition related to gender equality, perhaps this book is not something they're going to gravitate towards or find refreshing. But for people, I think even like me growing up in the church, for people who are hungry and are seeking or wrestling with questions that they seem to just be ignored and silenced, right? We just don't talk about it. Feminism is something external to orthodoxy, or as one of the Russian patriarchs mentioned at one point, it's heretical within orthodoxy. I mean, one thing I note within the book and the introduction is that feminism isn't just one thing, right? So we all have assumptions. It's a very loaded category. It has different instantiations across the world in different cultural contexts and different time periods. So it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book in some ways is reclaim and bridge a discourse between Orthodox and broadly Christian believers and people interested in Christianity and Orthodox Christianity who have yet to hear kind of a serious engagement around kind of feminist issues, feminist theological thinkers, and Orthodox Christianity. And then on the flip side, also, feminism, women's gender sexuality studies, oftentimes looks at Orthodoxy and says, well, you don't have feminist theology. How did this tradition just skip it? We see it in all different other faith traditions. How is Orthodoxy kind of just missing this component? And in some ways, this project doesn't do enough in that area. That's always the next book. There's more to say about how feminist theology is extant and already kind of women's engagement in writings in the last century or so. But I think for me, it was important to have it front and center to say there is an area that should be critiqued, that can be critiqued within Orthodox tradition from a feminist perspective. And so hopefully people will pick it up, even if they're initially kind of off-put by that term in the title, will be maybe intrigued to read how I see Orthodox tradition as having kind of deep spaces for feminist engagement and feminist theological resources. So I think for me, it's important to have it in the title, even though initially it wasn't my idea. I think I really love the fact that it is there, because when somebody's looking for, okay, we see, Catholic feminist theology, we see Muslim feminist theology, we see Jewish feminist theology, to what happened with Orthodoxy. It's not speaking across everything in all time periods, but it's just one example of we can think with feminist thinkers and see our own tradition, the Orthodox tradition, in a new light, in a way that I see it as being not deconstructing Orthodoxy, but to help us see Orthodoxy even better, right? Even as perhaps our theological claims suggest that it should be, which is really affirming the full humanity of everyone, women included.
I think that's one of the most important things about this book is you're not bringing feminism as something from outside, and you're not attempting to introduce something into Orthodoxy that isn't already there within the center, the heartbeat of the tradition. And so what's so important in this book is the work you do in pulling out what are the resources within Orthodoxy, where in Orthodoxy are the tools for understanding human nature in a way that feminism, in fact, is not an external act that one has to do, but a way of living that makes sense because Orthodoxy teaches a way of living in which all persons are included fully, wholly.
Well, and I mean, one thing when I was researching the book that I kept coming across is Orthodoxy, by and large, doesn't have a problem claiming women's spiritual equality.
Right.
So there's no problem. Women are deified, men are deified. Women are saints, men are saints. There's no question there. The hiccup, the challenge, the stumbling block, if you will, for me that I kept seeing was wrestling with women's humanity. That's where kind of the gender hierarchy came into play of, well, if it just, this is all sorts of cultural constructions of gender, historically embedded, across time within the church, but in some ways saying there's just something less about women's humanity, about their bodies, about their experiences, that renders them kind of subordinate or just a step below, or gives them more room that they need to cover. And so I think for me, feminism at least points to that experiential, that in an Orthodox term, incarnational, but also that humanity, that difference in that positionality. So even though I'm not bringing, saying like, well, here's how Western secular feminist theory can just make Orthodoxy better. I definitely don't want to do that. But I am positioned, as a scholar in the United States, raised in this kind of cultural context. And so certain questions are absolutely formed by my own positionality in that context and my own experience with feminist thinkers. So even though it's not saying here, these will help us understand our tradition in a new light in a way that will destroy it, for me, it's thinking alongside, right? Like having these kind of questions raised by someone like Mary Daly, generations now ago, helps then us think about our own Orthodox tradition. Do these apply? If not, why not? right? What are our answers? So not just kind of importing things, but having that conversation space to think alongside questions that are being raised around the world, really.
I think it's really important. There has been so much vitality and so much liveliness in feminist thought, and to bring that together is a really it's an inspiring thing that you do, but it's also a very richly productive thing. It's generative
Mm-hmm.
of new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing, and that's going to be really important as people read this and hopefully think now, what can they see differently? What can they hear differently? What now might we do in slightly adjusted ways? One of the things I think that's so important in this book is thinking about the way one does theology and how. And I think that for many people, theology is something that happens in thick, heavy tomes with big words that you don't understand, long philosophical discourses that I certainly get lost in the first paragraphs of. And two things that you do that I think are so important, among the many important things in this book. One is to take theology seriously as an intellectual and academic act of thinking that's rigorous and disciplined and intellectually deep. I have a dean who talks about the humanities as a place where we do deep thinking. Well, this is a place to do deep thinking. But the other thing is, in thinking theologically and in approaching the Orthodox Church theologically, you make the move right there in chapter 2 to considerably widen what counts as resources for theological inquiry. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is incredibly important for women who often don't have the opportunities for the study of theology that sometimes are available to men in a tradition where women are not included in the hierarchical work of the church, but also for lay people more broadly, what counts as a source of theological awareness, theological knowledge, theological thinking. So in this book, you draw on many kinds of sources, and those sources are the things that Orthodox people do all the time. Who are the saints you commemorate? What are the feast days you pay attention to? What kind of prayer practice do you follow? How do you take note of liturgy as an embodied experience where there are fragrances and sights and sounds and textures, bodily postures and actions? How are all of these things theologically meaningful and theologically fruitful? And I think a lot of people, well, that's what they do, and it's deeply meaningful. I mean, we've just been through Holy Week, so we're absolutely drenched in it. I always think people from other traditions have no idea. And people will say this is the most meaningful thing to them, but they don't think of these things, participating in Holy Week services, whatever, praying in front of icons, remembering their patron saint. Is this doing theology? And in this book, you argue that these things that we do, these practices, are in fact doing theology. Yeah. So maybe you could say something about what it is to make that kind of move and how that connects with a more prosaic tradition of producing, long theological treatises.
Well, I mean, I think certainly within Orthodox Christianity, and I mean, Susan, you know this from your own work, but Evagrius gives us that definition of a theologian as one who prays. So certainly, I mean, if we look at, and one of the things this book is really focused on is not just kind of like modern, contemporary, kind of feminist theological arguments, but grappling with, within Orthodoxy, we have a tradition that informs theology. It's not just scripture, it's not just teachings from priests, it's also this living tradition. And, it doesn't have a one kind of size fits all stable definition, but it's filled with genres, actions, liturgical moments, pious devotion, hymns, spiritual teachings, desert sayings, models of saints. There's so much in there, right, that we can draw on and look to besides just, let's say, Gregory Palamas's triads, or, these discursive kind of, let's think about God. And I think one of the things that Orthodoxy gives its practitioners is really deep theological resources as theology through praxis and theology as a relationship with God. So you could know everything you want to know about God, but you're always going to fall short. But once you start to do the kind of theological work where you know God through relationship, well, then you're starting to, it's a more dynamic, it's something that you're living. So the kind of the second part of that is that certainly there's a place we need these kind of creedal formulations. We need the big, big books, but that can't be all that is theology or all that is representing tradition. And one of the reasons I say that is because if we do that, we're leaving out at least half, probably more than half the church, right? Because even the tradition isn't privileging just men. It's a particular type of educated, often clerical or monastic man who had the resources to be educated at seminary or pursue the priesthood. So there's also kind of this looking at tradition and the sources of theology more broadly as where is the Holy Spirit at work in time in people's lives. And so now if we take a much more kind of capacious, broader conception, kind of going back to those like people who pray, if we look at theology, now we can include women who are largely absent from the sainted fathers of Orthodoxy. We have a few mothers, but even their writings are kind of controlled and passed on under the purview of kind of that patriarchal religious hierarchy. And so there's I don't want to say there's censoring necessarily, but there's mechanisms where, well, there might have been some other lady who had sayings, but hers were a little challenging to certain kind of norms and systems within the church, so maybe hers didn't get passed on. So I think one of the reasons I turn to theology and tradition and conceive it in this much broader way is to look for kind of, well, where are the women, right? Which often are just glossed over in silence, but also where is God at work in the church already revealing kind of the type of freedom or affirmation of women in their lives, and where do they see it? Because a lot of times I'm glad you brought up laity, for a lot of laity, it may not be in the big, thick, patristic tomes. It may not be in, the nitty-gritty canons and canonical kind of teachings of the church. It'll be, well, what did my grandmother do? She taught me how to go to church. She taught me how to pray. And so there is a level also kind of ways of, not just women, but ways of knowing in religion that's not, people know their faith, they know what their tradition is, even if they can't recite, oh, here's long quotations from John Chrysostom, or, here's these particular things that I should know as content of my faith, but they might know it through practice, right? And through relationship with other Orthodox Christians, whether they be saints or family members or people at their parish. So I see all that informing both tradition and then informing theology much more broadly, in the broadest sense.
Yeah, I think of this as something, there are many ways of being learned. There are many kinds of literacy,
Mm-hmm.
and liturgical literacy is really important. People who've gone to it, the importance of learning it from your grandmother. I mean, it actually is true, I believe, from the very beginning, that churches are mainly filled with women.
Right.
And are off doing whatever men do, but the women are there. And it's often the mothers and the grandmothers who are the sources of continuity in local communities. These are people who've gone to church all their lives, grown up, heard it all their lives, sung these hymns all their lives, carry that music
Mm-hmm.
and in their ears and in their, in the,
Right.
and there's a knowledge that comes from that grows, it
Right.
and that can be very, very rich and is different from the book learning that, other kinds of literacy often privileged more. But I've been trying, even in my own work as well as watching this in the parish,
Mhm.
valuing that experience that comes from really just living it, not knowing it as something you read in a book, but this is something that you do.
Right, right. Orthodoxy is something that's practice. It doesn't mean we can't think about it. I don't want to say, well, just, pray. I mean, here I am. I just wrote the book on it, right? So I don't want to put us both out of a job.
Ashley's book, right?
But there is something to practice. And I mean, there's kind of two things. I think one of the reasons that I kind of made this move, which is not, I mean, it's intrinsic to orthodoxy. I'm not doing something like particularly feminist here and saying, well, theology is more. I mean, it's right there. If you look at who are the authorities, a lot of times it's the monks in the desert who are writing not big theological tomes. Some are just like, here's a saying we have recorded of this person, this holy person. But we're also not going to find in the fathers or in kind of church tradition some kind of closeted feminist statement about women that we can just import into present times. We're not going to find it. So then all the resources of tradition, as they're like written down and recorded in the church, are still, and I mean, this is something I bring out in chapter 2, are still patriarchal. And so that kind of heritage, that control, that situation needs to be acknowledged for them to be usable then for making kind of feminist arguments. It doesn't mean they have to be thrown out. It just means that that situatedness needs to be addressed. And a lot of times as Orthodox, we look like, well, what do the fathers say? What does tradition say? But if we have a very narrow view of what tradition is, maybe just patristic writings or something, or if we have a very narrow view of what theology is, we're going to be very limited in how we can think about not just gender, but a whole host of kind of contemporary issues, and perhaps miss God at work in the church, in the lives of everybody. I mean, I don't want to say just women who go to church, but yes, women being the preservers of orthodoxy, and this is something I bring out in that last chapter. Women being really responsible for hiding and preserving icons and icon veneration. Women being the first to proclaim the gospel. Mary Magdalene, will be singing about her in a few weeks' time in the Orthodox liturgical calendar again, but even already at Pascha, it's just front and center. The importance that women have in carrying on the tradition. That's not to say, though, that women also don't perpetuate kind of those patriarchal values within the faith, too. So part of that handing down of tradition sometimes comes with also teaching, here's how to be an Orthodox woman. Don't rock the boat, don't question the hierarchy. But it also gives, more often than not, also strategies for navigating, when when you encounter some sort of teaching that is problematic or your priest ignores you or something, there are still resources to be Orthodox and be an Orthodox woman in a way that are deeply rich and committed to your faith. And so there's already that kind of creativity. We see it in some saints' lives, some subversive saints' lives stories who, the priest wouldn't give them the blessing. And we see it in the gospel even, right? The woman touches Jesus's hem. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't go to the disciples. I mean, we can imagine these things. So there's a lot of creativity and I mean, I'm sure you see this in your own work, Susan, on hymns, imagining what Jesus and Mary were saying at the cross, right? That type of kind of creativity within the tradition isn't people just making stuff up. They can reasonably, let's say, speak for another because they know them. They don't know just about them. And I think that makes a big difference in kind of how people think about theology and the sources of tradition.
Talk about the fact that, as many people would say who are concerned about whether feminism could be a positive or a negative notion to bring into the church, you talk about the fact that yes, Orthodoxy has women saints, remembers women from the past. Yes, there are 4 women named in the collection of the sayings of desert fathers amongst the dozens and dozens and dozens of desert monks. So yes, there's a commemoration of sacred women. And you talk about the fact that it's been a curated memory.
Right.
And can't remember if you actually used that particular
I
term.
don't, but I should have.
That is to say that those witnesses that women have provided at different times have been included um, in our books of memory, so to speak, shaped in a particular way, and certain things are left out and certain things are left in. I think as a historian, this is something I struggle with constantly, because as someone I spend a lot of time working in these early Christian centuries and Byzantine period, there is constant reference in our historical sources to the fact that there were women in local communities. Sometimes they were nuns, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were married women, sometimes they were widows, sometimes they were women who lived alone. But women to whom people came, they came to be taught. They brought their children. I took my son the women, we don't have the women's things, but we have men saying, my mother took me every week to visit this holy woman, and we stood in line with all the many mothers who brought their children, and all the local abbots from all the local monasteries would come to her for teaching. Now, wouldn't we like to know her teaching?
Right.
But we
If
don't.
only someone would have written it down.
And so one of the things I feel as a historian constantly is an awareness of what we've lost. Like, we have the evidence of women's leadership, of women's contributions. Because we've lost their words, we also have a tradition, now small t, of telling the story of Orthodox Christianity without those women.
Yep.
And so we have an impoverished story that we tell about our own history.
We do, and we hold it up triumphantly too. This is the true faith. This is the unchanging, and while God's unchanging, our kind of human incarnational reality is always changing, and it's missing things, right? Our kind of fided perception is really missing things. One thing I think that is important, and I mentioned this briefly in the conclusion of the book, is that the importance of kind of theology, not just including kind of its own tradition very broadly, but also thinking in the scholarly discipline, using the insights from history, from sociology. This is how we know what Orthodox women were doing in the past, or what their lives look like in the present, right? So if we just kind of think about what do those big tomes or those big theological books say, we're not going to find much, right? There's a jarring absence. But if we can kind of draw these other disciplines, which I know even you students are like, oh, I'm not a theologian, but you are, right? Because you're doing your historical work often in service of giving other women a voice, right? Or filling in our tradition so we can know it better. So we won't tell Brown, kind of in your studies department.
But let's take what you just said as a chance to go on to, I feel like there's a big elephant in the room often for Orthodox. And that is, as you were just saying, the devotion is to timeless and eternal truths. Truth with a capital T. God is an eternal and unchanging. I hear people talk about this all the time. Eternal and unchanging reality. And yet, you and I are here, we are talking about history and time is change. And I often say to students, God may be unchanging. Religion has a history. If it has a history, they're going to have to deal with it.
Done by people.
It's done by people. So how can you help us, how you're bridging between that issue of the eternal, unchanging truths to which Orthodoxy claims to bear witness? And this work of understanding that what we do might have changed what was done in the past. As one of the things in my work, I see women had much more active, even labeled roles in the ancient church than are allowed to have now. So change that we've done and change that we need to do.
I think this gets into things. A lot of your work, Susan, on kind of historical memory, liturgical memory. How do we commemorate? And so one thing that I keep drawing back to is it's not just enough to say, like, historically we know about these people, or these are historical kind of outliers, misogynistic comments from various patristic fathers, that we can just say, okay, but the whole tradition, the core of it, that unchanging truth is not problematic. It's not patriarchal. It's not misogynistic. It affirms equality. But Orthodox theology, I mean, it really does center on the divine human incarnation, right? Because God became human, because the Holy Spirit dwells in the members of the church, therefore constitutes the body of Christ. There is an attention to the changing, the temporal, the cultural, and all these kind of situations. So there is a little bit of, we're going to find problems, but we don't have to dismiss those as outliers, because we can also look at kind of the whole structure. God is not the problem. It's the humans that are the problem. So then we should be, because Orthodoxy has such a strong heritage of repentance, right? Transformation, theosis. We're never going to become fully like God. We come as close. It's an ongoing process. It doesn't end in kind of stasis here, bring up some patristic themes. But there's always like further and further recognition of our shortcomings, right? And then further like ways to try and know God, because we're never fully going to know God, but we will experience God through communion. And so I think that's part of the way we can look back at tradition and not say we were wrong, as much as say we've missed things. It was incomplete, and now we can learn more. So it's not just throwing out and saying, well, all that historical stuff is problematic because it's not, it doesn't promote gender equality. Well, of course not. It's coming from the pre-modern world. It's not gonna have some sort of, radical affirmation of especially understanding gender as many people do today. So at the same time, we don't need to just replicate and mimic what we think was in the past. So we can kind of allow the Spirit to guide the church, but also, as maybe a pious activity, keep seeking back for those missed saints, those missed activities of the Holy Spirit. So when we hold up like, this is the faith of our fathers, or I mentioned as one point of kind of gender inequality that men get to say at like an ecumenical council, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit. That's not a statement that women ever get to say, because they're not bishops. But that aside, but there's kind of a little bit of triumphalism within Orthodoxy that can be very problematic in terms of political and cultural realities. But also, I don't think that needs to go, the triumphalism. We can have that joy in Christ, that joy in the faith in God, but then how does that faith become incarnate in different historical moments? It's never fully realized. Right? We never fully can completely see God at work. There's always something a little hidden. And so I think there's a path for looking to the past and trying to uncover those blind spots. And then also always recognition, kind of an apophatic tension of, we have the true faith, but we can't possibly know all the true faith. So there's a little bit of an unsaying, a hesitation there. That I think keeps us humble and keeps us penitent and helps us then kind of engage in that feminist theological praxis from within Orthodoxy, that we can see, when we, configure women, construct women in these ways, or miss women, what might that do to their humanity? What might that do to their belonging in church? Are we setting ourselves up to kind of sacralize certain gender hierarchies that then diminish women even beyond kind of the walls of the church in their lives, set themselves up for things like more abusive relationships or fewer educational opportunities, things that now the church not necessarily would have said in antiquity, but now they're saying, yes, women should be able to go to seminary if they want to. They should be able to have theological education. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect that I think the historical, the temporal, in this moment, like even the personal, right? The human really does matter, because God put on our full humanity. And so I think, at least one of the things I try and do, at least in, I think it's chapter 4, is make an incarnational kind of claim that if we're affirming Jesus became human, God became, remaining fully divine, but he became fully human, where did that humanity came from? It came from the Palestinian Jewish woman Mary. It came from, so we have to affirm women have full humanity. Otherwise, Jesus now has a jeopardized humanity, and the whole theological project somewhat falls apart. And so I think there's the deep kind of in that dogmatic, there's some rationale for why attending to the situational, the culturally limited, the particular is important, and to use an Orthodox term, can be an icon of that fuller divine archetype.
Well, right. And one of the this book, what this is a wonderful book. I'm just speaking to our listeners now. One of the wonderful things about this book is it takes your reader on a journey. And so we start by looking around and seeing questions and experiencing. We start by then moving into Orthodoxy and what it looks like and its resources, and moving through the problems as well as the silences or the absences or let's call it the critique part. And in a university, the word critique is a word we cherish because it's a good act, but often for many people it sounds like a negative word. So an important thing, maybe the most important thing about this book, is you take us through a journey where we can look critically, and I mean that positively,
right,
at the tradition, at the resources, at the teachings that Orthodoxy puts in front of people. And then you take us to a place where we begin the constructive work of what can we do that can more fully realize the theological truths that in fact are profoundly embedded in this tradition. And so it's in the final two chapters that you take this move, which is positive and constructive. I still think that critique is a positive act, but let's look forward. Let's talk about what we can do better, right? This is last two.
And now I'm proposing some solutions.
Yeah, some gentle acts of moving forward. And
right,
you have two chapters, and the first chapter is where you speak of undoing.
right.
And then you have the chapter where you speak of cultivating fullness of presence. So and you do these using very traditional Orthodox theological categories. So the undoing, you turn to, and these are big words that are familiar to Orthodox, but they're still hard words: kenosis, apophasis, and hesychasm. Kenosis is the self-emptying that God did in becoming human. Apophasis is that what lies beyond speech, recognizing that there's something beyond speech. And hesychasm, well, you expand the meanings on all of these words, and maybe you can talk about hesychasm for a minute here, but why do we need to undo before we turn to the doing? Or what is it we are undoing first?
I mean, part of it is not just kind of a process. I feel like Orthodox are always, as kind of part of a penitential life, always recognizing kind of shortcomings or sinfulness and undoing that. And then you're not just kind of stripping yourself down. And then there needs to be a replacement with virtue, with activity, right? With becoming more like God. So it's not just a negation of the self. And then eventually you'll find, that divine image somehow within you. There's a stripping down, but also a cultivation. And these two chapters in some ways are also slightly different audiences. So the one about unsaying in some ways is a little bit more directed at those that might be in positions of church privilege, right? So clergy, perhaps men. I mean, I don't want to lump everybody together, but those who have been privileged in the tradition already, what can they do to kind of not continue to perpetuate patriarchy in a problematic way in their faith? And then the second chapter, in some ways, is, I mean, not that women also perpetuate the patriarchy, and I don't want to say that like in a feminist holding up a sign kind of down with the patriarchy way, but there's kind of multiple ways that term is used within Orthodoxy, where kind of the problematic side of it is just shielded, right? We just don't talk about it. We have patriarchates, we're organized in this way, we have priestly fathers, we have patriarchs who lead the church. So the problematic nature of it is somewhat kind of just obscured. So one thing I try and do is show, well, it still is problematic in a power kind of power structure way. So first chapter is addressing kind of those that might have that more privileged position within the tradition. And the second chapter then is thinking about those who've been marginalized in the tradition. Are they supposed to just be more humble, just be more subordinate? Are they supposed to just kind of further diminish themselves? Are there resources for them to advocate for themselves or to defend themselves or to say, no, I can kind of be in this position and not somehow be unorthodox when I say, no, I have a right. Rights language is very controversial within Orthodox discourse, but I have a calling to be in this space, or I know God affirms me as a full human kind of person in this space. So there's slightly different audiences, but certainly I think that praxis point is always kind of ongoing. It's not like we just kind of strip ourselves down and say, well, I've emptied myself of that patriarchal privilege. I have unsaid that ultimacy where I went and looked at tradition and said I had all figured out. And the hesychasm part is, and now I approach people in kind of a humble position of quietude, not presuming to tell women, and here, you just come serve in our parish council, and now you have gender equality, not trying to tell other people how to be, just as, let's say, in a hesychastic moment, the monks are awaiting God's self-disclosure, right? There's a humbling of the self, and then a penitential awaiting of a disclosure that might never come. Someone could be saying the Jesus prayer for decades and never see the divine light. Others might just be struck by it walking down the street. So there's a little bit of, not that, men are sinners and women are God. I'm not trying to make kind of that dichotomy, but the idea of men are not, those in positions of privilege are not entitled to those that have been marginalized for them to then share themselves or their gifts with them on their own terms. So there's a little bit of this term just means quietude. Often is, entangled with the practice of the Jesus prayer and these psychosomatic practices of prayer and theosis. But for me, it really shows, how do we encounter the other in a way that respects their otherness and allows a disclosure or a revelation, we'll say, a meeting point with them where there's not a dominating impetus for me to tell you how you should be, but for us to just encounter. And so I think that was something that these aren't the only resources within the tradition, but three that I thought might be helpful and could be a starting point to think about what are the resources in the tradition that help us undo, right? What are the touch points where we can go and reflect on something that's so centered in our tradition and help us undo some of these problematic areas that I critique or identify. So I think that's kind of that first chapter. And then the second is, okay, we've stripped down, now what, right? What can we leave women with? I mean, kenosis, one thing I note in that first chapter is that hesychasm's been used against women, right? Women can't go to Mount Athos, not that that's all that happens there, but there's a problematic association of the body as being taboo. Women are inherently fleshy, right? There's somehow limitations on their spiritual life, despite the numerous female saints. Apophasis, again, kind of negating into oblivion, negating or unsaying the body and kind of just this mystical, unembodied reality. And kenosis as a way of kind of doubling down of women. You're already self-sacrificial, maybe in your homes, maybe in your church. You just need to empty yourself more. And, this is Valerie Saving's, kind of famous observation that this is very problematic for women to just be told to give until there's nothing left. And so giving then an alternative in kind of that last real substantive chapter says, here are some resources for advocacy. This is not represented in our tradition in a very robust way. We're focused a lot more on the humility, the self-giving, the subordination. So are there any resources we can draw on to say, no, women should be joyful, should be affirmed as being fully human, can advocate for things like equality, or various positions. And so there I draw on kind of already subversive saints, as we mentioned, and then this little bit that I call the possible proclamation that, we're in the possible season right now, but the idea that if God has already, Jesus being kind of this gate breaker, then why is the church a gatekeeper around issues related to gender? So is there a way that that joy that is bestowed in the resurrection, death is overcome, oppression is overcome, right? The most oppressive force, right? Here of death. So now we're giving this possible joy. What proclaims life, right? The women are proclaiming life, and Christ has given this life even to them. So just kind of that affirming that joy, which I think it doesn't need to supplant what's already in the tradition, but helps kind of counterbalance it, because there's just such a disproportionate kind of emphasis on that self-giving, that self-emptying, obedience, humility, which when you're already socialized, as women often are in other marginalized groups, to be in positions of social subordination and obedience and humility, it's very hard then to feel affirmed, loved by God, quite frankly. Right. And that opens up again avenues for abuse and problematic power dynamics that do not reflect, right, the image and likeness of God.
Right. And I think you were just mentioning the hemorrhaging woman. Something I've been thinking about a lot in my own work is when you look at the women saints who are remembered, who are venerated in the church, they are not by and large presented as meek, submissive, and silent. The hemorrhaging woman was silent. She doesn't have a man advocating for her. She doesn't have anyone with her. She acts.
Mm-hmm.
She acts despite the obstacles. And this is true over and over again. The Canaanite woman, the Samaritan woman, Mary Magdalene. They didn't have men out there interceding for them, or they did what they needed to do. And in the gospel accounts, that includes affirming Christ as Lord.
Right.
Which the disciples themselves seem to have trouble doing. So
yeah.
You, at the same time that you are in that final chapter, urging women towards advocacy and towards a new kind of vision, again, you're drawing from very deep the women at the resurrection.
Right.
You're drawing from very deep models that are at the center of Orthodox history and Orthodox.
Already draw on. So we do have more recent Orthodox women writers who turn and say, here's how I know that I'm not supposed to just be silent and subordinate, because the women in the gospel were. Jesus ate with them, Jesus touched them and talked with them. And so there's kind of this, I'm not trying to just import something and say, here's my interpretation of the tradition, but a lot of this, even as problematic as some of those kind of curated examples of women are in the tradition, something I call like the patriarchal woman, right? Those constructions. There are also other examples that are very subversive, very empowering, and how women relate to them, even those more kind of patriarchally curated examples, is often very empowering. And it may not always be reflected in the liturgical commemoration of the saint, but through the stories of the saint or how the woman prays to the saint or sees. I mean, there's a lot of these very beautiful reflections of contemporary Orthodox women reflecting on saints in ways that's nowhere reflected kind of in the official liturgical life of the church. And so again, women's kind of voices and reflections are missing, but they're important. They're very important because God perhaps gave those saints to the church so that women could have them, and men, right?
Honoring their memory, whether or not we have the exact words, again, back to what we
right.
But honoring the memory of women who from the very beginning have been willing to commit their lives, commit their talents, commit their devotion, pulls us back again to this center, and to a center that's been there, because in fact, that center is unchanging.
Right.
So when you finish this book, you have finished it in a real act of hope and an act of encouragement that includes courage, including your courage to write this book, for your readers. And so you've taken us, as I say, on this journey where we arrive at a place where the book ends, but we begin.
Right.
It's over, and that's a wonderful gift that you've given.
Thank you. It's one of those places when I would describe the project, sometimes people would say, well, you're just trying to tear down the church or you just want women priests. But I think, especially in this book, I'm trying to point to a bigger issue, right? The kind of pervasiveness of inequality that then appears to be sacralized in the church through commemoration and through worship and
Hierarchy.
whose voices are included. And so for me, that's not just a kind of social problem or feeling excluded, but it points to missing the heart of the tradition, right? We're getting God wrong. We're getting God's revelation in the church. We're missing parts of it. And we're kind of patting ourselves on the back saying, no, we've got it. And so I think just, I do end it in kind of hope and humility that somebody else needs to come along and explore all of these kind of missing pieces. And it's my hope for the church not to kind of pull it apart or, deconstruct it, but to expose certain areas so that they can be healed and greater awareness can be brought forth about God at work at the church and in the lives of women and what he may be calling them to. And so I think that was something that I was encouraged, at least in closing this. I thought, oh, there are going to be certain people that really just hate this book, but for others, it might be something that gives them hope. And so I think maybe they're my primary audience as people that are looking for a way to grapple with what they might perceive as inconsistencies or kind of a double standard of the church affirms my full humanity and my equality outside of the church. But then when I walk in those doors, I'm expected, there are only men at the front. So there's kind of a disconnect that many women encounter. So for those that's not the issue, then I doubt they would read the book. But even so, they might find resources within it to think about their own tradition, or if they come from a different religious tradition, how kind of that patriarchal heritage and authority within their faith is navigated and how it continues to have afterlives.
And that is where the book takes us.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your time for this very important conversation. Just again, Women in the Orthodox Tradition, Feminism, Theology, and Equality is available now from the University of Notre Dame Press. You can acquire that on the website or wherever books are sold. Again, Susan, Ashley, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
And thank you, David, for giving us this space and this time.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Susan, so much for being such a gracious conversation partner. It's always a treat.
Thank you for the book.